Episode number 63 of People I Know Show. Curt Carstensen from Minneapolis today, and joining me from most of the way across the world, in or near Sydney, Australia, Alec Sewell. Hello, good morning to you. It's good evening here.
Yeah, good evening. I've got my cup of coffee ready to go, and it's about 11 o'clock in the morning over here. I think it's, 7 or 8 or something over there, right?
It's an early evening on a very snowy Friday here outside of Minneapolis, so I don't know what's happening precisely there, but I know it's not snowing today.
No, it's definitely not snowing. It's a little bit of rain today, the last couple of days, which has been excellent. I think we'll probably touch on that, but because it's been quite dry and hot the last, months here in Sydney. But yeah, so we're getting a little bit of rain at the moment, which is great. But apart from that, it's a bit sweltering, a bit warm.
We will definitely get into that conversation. That leads into the timing of me asking you to be a guest on my show, as you're one of my handful of connections in Australia, and Australia's been all over the news lately here, which it isn't always. And so that'll be a topic for later, but I want to discuss how we came to meet and see if you remember it the same way. For me, it was late summer 2014, so we're going back, what's that, 5.5 years ago now, perhaps,
5 and a bit.
If my math is correct. I decided I was becoming a traveler, and I went on one of my, if not my first solo adventures. It was to Chicago, which is not all that far from Minneapolis, a short plane ride. But what I did is I took public transportation from my suburban home at that time to the airport, flew to Chicago, took the public transportation to the hostel in Chicago and stayed there for a few nights, just looking to see what would happen. And one of the things that happened was I shared, I believe it was a 4-bed room in the hostel, and you were one of the random people that were there, and we hung out. I think it was just for a few hours one morning, had breakfast, went for a jog together, and 5 years later, we're talking on the show, and we've met one time in between. So tell me about
exactly.
What were you up to that trip? I believe you had a wedding?
Yeah, so that's right. So I had a wedding in Montreal. One of my oldest friends, he was a primary school friend, like a real, I think we met when we were 4 or something like that. And he got married to someone he met because he was studying in the US, and he met a Canadian woman and from Montreal who was like a Anglophone from, so she spoke English. So my experience of going to Montreal was that there's, everyone that you meet speaks English, and then there's a bunch of French speaking people sort of in the background, which I understand is not the true experience of Montreal, but that's what it looked like to me. So I went to the wedding, but the thing is, to get to Montreal, to get to the sort of eastern, like Atlantic coast of North America from Australia, you need to kind of go one way or the other, like all around the world. So I thought, rather than just go there and then come back, it's such a long way to go, I thought I'd take a couple of weeks. So I'd gone to, I think I'd gone straight to Canada, and then I caught the train from Montreal down to New York City, which I'd never been to New York before. Spent a couple of days in New York, and then I knew someone, a friend of a friend, who'd come to Australia, and she lived in Indiana, I think.
Nice.
Yeah. So where was it?
That's the border of Chicago, the northwestern part of the town.
That's right. She lived in somewhere near South Bend in Indiana. So I had planned to, rather than sort of fly home from, because New York, you need to go New York, either LA or San Francisco. So rather than just sort of do the hop and then come back over the Pacific, I thought, like, seeing as I'm sort of in the neighborhood, I'll go and visit, which she was surprised because, from her perspective, like, no one is in the neighborhood of South Bend, Indiana, because it's kind of, from her perspective, kind of tucked away into, out in, like away from the center, the center of, where things are. So, but from my perspective, like, I'd gone so far to get to Montreal, to New York, I thought, like, I may as well just visit. So I dropped in for a few days over there, and I thought, seeing as, in order to get to South Bend or Goshen or wherever it was, you need to like, you can't just go straight there. There's no airports there. So you need to go, I think the easiest place to go was Chicago. And then I thought, like Chicago, it's a sort of like, I've seen movies about Chicago. But I've never been there, never spent any time there. Don't know anything really about it apart from just sort of like what's in pop culture and stuff like that. So I thought, oh, I don't know, like spend a day and just explore the place. And so I had nothing to do. And then, except for, I think, what was the one thing that I had? That's right. There is another podcast, which I haven't listened to for ages, but I used to listen to, called This American Life,
Yes.
which is from their studio is in the middle of what I discovered was a theme park, a children's sort of amusement park right in Chicago, right on the kind of foreshore there. So I thought, I'll go and, see where that podcast is made. That's the only thing I knew about Chicago, really. So I thought I'd go there and then I catch a train. So I had like 24 hours between when the plane landed and when the train left. And, apart from seeing this amusement park where the studios for whatever that radio show is that, whatever the radio station is that makes This American Life.
WXYZ in Chicago, I believe.
That's the one. Yeah.
Stop listening to that show. I think I started listening to it. Perhaps.
Right. Yeah, no, it's a great show. Right. So I saw that and then I had nothing to do. And then we met and so we just kind of hit it off. And I remember we went for a jog and I kept passing people on the left. And you kept saying, "What are you doing? You're just running into people." because in Australia, everyone drives on the left, and so you're walking along the footpath, the sidewalk, then you end up walking on the left just because it's sort of the natural thing to do. And like intellectually, I knew that obviously, that's not the case in North America, but like habits are hard to break, so I just kept running into people, and you were like, "Do they drive on the left in Australia? What's going on? What are you doing? Why are you constantly running into people?" Yeah.
That all sounds very familiar. And
right.
I was practicing or training, I suppose, for a 5K at that time, I would assume. So we ran out by the lake. And I don't know if you were a runner really at that time or you just decided to join me. Was that something you would have done by yourself?
Yeah. So yes, I did for a couple of years. My girlfriend, now my wife, was kind of into running, and so she kind of talked me into / invited me to do some half marathons, which is like 21.1 Ks or whatever that is, 12, 13 miles, something like that.
13.1 miles, I think.
Yeah, that's it. So which is like much longer than I would be. When we met, I think I'd run 5 kilometers once. And so then she was like, "Yeah, just sign up for this half marathon. It's fine. Like if you can run 5Ks, you could train up." And so I hated it. I hated the training because, every time you run, you're running further than you've ever run before ever in your life. Like when you're training up to get to that distance. But once you've done it, then you sort of, I don't know. Like once you've got the fitness to run 20 Ks, you can run a couple of 3 or 4 Ks fairly easily. So I kind of kept that up for a while. And then since then it's sort of, I don't know, petered out. I went for a 5K jog this morning and it just completely smashed me. So I got to, pick that up again. What about you? How's your running going?
Well, each year for about, I think 9 years now, I've ran at least one 5K. That was the year though, thinking back 2014, it had happened a few months prior, but that was the one year that I ran a 10-mile.
Right.
I can relate very much that every time I trained, it was a longer run than I'd ever done. And kind of ran out of time to get the entire training. So I think my longest training run was 7.5 miles. And then on race day, I did 10 miles. I must have had to walk about a mile of it because that uphill at mile 7 or 8, when they put that in there, that was much for me. But I still managed a time right around 9 minutes for me not being super athletic and not running much my whole life. I look back on that and think I must have trained well to accomplish that while walking as much as I did. And I remember a very emergency bathroom break somewhere in there too, where I mistimed that, and I still managed a pretty good time. So yeah, but since then, I remember being in so much pain after that I thought if I never do this again, I'll be okay. But I think there's still a chance that someone will convince me that I could do another one of those at some point.
That's satisfying to be able to. Yeah, I mean, since then I've sort of gotten into exercising in kind of like, going to the gym, doing weights, and just in the last 12 months I've started doing like triathlons, which are shorter distances of running, but you do like a swim and then a bike ride and then a run as well. And I don't know, it seems like a good sport for me because it's, the distances are slightly shorter. I mean, unless you do like an Ironman or anything like that, but it means that it's a really satisfying sort of piece of exercise to do, and it means that you have to kind of combine things in interesting ways. And yeah, so I've been enjoying that. I guess I'm a bit like you. Each year I've tried to sort of do something exercise-wise, just in the last sort of probably since we met, I think in the last sort of 5 or 6 or 7 years. Each year I've tried to do something that challenges me in a way that I haven't been challenged before. So last year was a friend signed us up to do a triathlon, do a sprint triathlon, which is like a shorter version. And this year we're going to do a slightly longer triathlon. But I mean, I think what you said about training resonates with me, where, if you set yourself a training plan, and then you just stick to it, then there's something about being able to, like each bit of the training is quite hard, but then you get to the end of the training and suddenly you're able to do something that would have been inconceivable when you started. And it makes sense. It does, when you put it in so many words, it just doesn't sound that impressive, but there's something about, the fact that, the human body just responds to stimulus like that. Like you challenge yourself and you just get fitter. I mean, it's how it works, but it's impressive and it's like satisfying to be part of.
I realized over the years that I don't have much interest in working out. I really haven't kept those habits up very well, unless I've had someone else that's holding me accountable. Precisely, I had a friend that I would go to the gym with 3 days a week, and knowing that he would be there, then I would show up. But if I had to go myself, I wouldn't. But when I am training for something, so each year if I have at least one thing on the calendar, I'll do the minimum, or I'll do enough to do that. But I realize I probably need about 3 or 4 things throughout the year to really keep it prominent in my life. And I don't do that every year, but last year I did a Spartan run, which has been a topic of conversation on the podcast before, which I didn't train enough for to really succeed, except I trained enough to get through it, which was still one of the best athletic accomplishments of my life. So I'd imagine it's not the same as a triathlon, but it's kind of similar in the way that you really have to push yourself to a whole new level and use more than just like your legs to run and your lungs. You got to use other parts of your body for strength.
Yeah, that's right. And I've never done one of those, but maybe that's the challenge for next year, do something completely out of left field. But I mean, that sort of appeals to me, not necessarily in terms of winning, but in terms of just sort of even getting to the point where you can finish in a satisfying time or whatever it is. Then it's just pushing your body to another level, which I don't know. I find satisfaction in being able to do that, in being able to sort of know at the start of when you sign up that you're at a certain level of fitness, and then through the process find that you're able to just push yourself to the next level. I don't know, because it's all it's just arbitrary. It's just sort of what's 5Ks as compared to 5.5K. Like it's a bit arbitrary, but it's satisfying to be able to to get through it once you've done it.
Yeah, my advice to leave that part of the conversation, put it on the calendar, and then put other smaller training days on the calendar, and and you'll make progress. And you seem to have figured that
That's
out
right.
well. Alec,
Yeah.
have you been to the United States besides that trip? I recall us talking about this, but I don't really remember.
Yes. So two other times. I went when I was a kid. My dad had a job for 6 months in the UK, and I think we went there on the way over, because again, you need to sort of either go through sort of over Asia and over through Europe, or go the other way and go through North America. And so I think we went there when I was like 9 or something. And then apart from that, when my wife Amy and I got married, we had decided to. So I was studying to do a PhD, and I just finished just before we got married. And that's kind of like a large, for the last 18 months, you just sort of don't really take any time off. And so she also hadn't taken much time off. And so by the time we finished, she had, I think, 10 weeks of like vacation leave owing to her. And I didn't have a job because I just finished this PhD. So we thought, oh, well, rather than, let's just put all of our stuff in storage and just take off for, as long as we can, afford to. And so we thought, the other thing we thought was we'd like to see Cuba, not for any particular reason, just because, I've got images of like old cars and beautiful music and stuff like that. And again, so Cuba being in the Atlantic, to get there from here, you need to either go through North America or South America. And so we thought, so in our honeymoon, we went to a few spots in, I think we went to New York City, and then we drove sort of through the Midwest up to visit a friend who was studying in upstate New York, up in at Cornell up there.
Okay.
And then we came back to New York, and then we went to Cuba, and then on the way back we where did we go? I think we went to San Francisco for a few days. So that's they're my 3 experiences. So when I was a kid, when I got married, and then the time that we met.
So which was the most recent one? The one you just spoke about, or the time that we met?
No, the most recent one. When we got married. So okay. That was 2016. 2016. Actually, that was November 2016. So it was just after the presidential election. Okay. Yeah, and it was a really interesting time to be in the country, because people were like, all of the placards were still up. When we were driving through, so we went to. We
call those yard signs here.
I think yard signs. Yeah, that's right.
The little metal stakes that people stick in their front yards, or there's billboards.
Yeah, vote for this guy, or vote for whoever. So we picked up a car. We hired a car in New York City, and then we drove from there to. We sort of thought we'd, just kind of go off the beaten track a little bit. So we drove to West Virginia, and then we drove up through Pennsylvania up to upstate New York. And all of as soon as you got out of New York City, there were not very many signs, have to say, for Hillary Clinton. Most of them were for Donald Trump, which is interesting because from the international media, a lot of the media attention was kind of assuming that Hillary Clinton was going to be the next president. So it was interesting to see that, there's actually not very many signs outside of the main cities for, people supporting Hillary Clinton. And then, we were driving through upstate New York, and Amy, my wife, she spotted one, and she said, "Oh, there's a sign for Hillary Clinton," and said Hillary for, and then the rest of it was obscured by snow. And we drove a bit further and saw another one that said Hillary for prison. So we were like, "Oh, I see, right. This is not a lot of support."
Yeah, that's kind of what happens. You stay in the city, you get one thing, and go in the rural areas, you get something else. And that's
right.
That's another topic I want to get into from your greater perspective of all that today. But let's chat now. I think we linked up on Facebook in 2014, and in the meantime, exchanged a few messages, but several years passed where we didn't speak at all, as this happens often on social media. But the point of it was to possibly meet up someday. So it was February of 2018, coming up on 2 years ago, that a couple friends and I were planning a trip to Australia. And I reached out to you and a couple other individuals around that time that were living in Australia or from Australia, just saying that we're coming, any advice, maybe we meet up. And as it turned out, I think we spent 3 days or 3 nights in Sydney. We met up with you one day and then your wife and you another day. And for people that haven't traveled or haven't like reconnected with people, I swear the best part of that trip was seeing you again and meeting your wife and seeing the others that I'd met before. It's like I made these basic connections with you some years ago, and now I see you again, and seeing you there and being in your habitat, your area, you like showing us around and giving us some history, that just makes the experience so much better. So I appreciate it. And that really added to the great trip it was.
And I totally echo what you're saying about the best experiences that I've had of traveling have been meeting people who, like you say, that it's your habitat, it's the kind of milieu of your life. It's where you live and where because otherwise, if you go somewhere and you just sort of do the, what's in the Lonely Planet guide, or, what you've read on Yelp or whatever, then, you get a sense of the place a little bit, but basically you get a sense of the place from the perspective of other people who are traveling. Whereas if you go and you meet people who are there, who live there, who spend their life there, then you'll not just get a sense of the place from the perspective of someone passing through. You'll get a sense of what life there might actually be like, which, sometimes is quite different. I do remember though, I think it was your last day in Sydney, you said, "Oh, can you give us any recommendations of places to go that would be, sort of like, from a local's perspective, and sort of off the beaten track sort of place." And I thought, yeah, I know exactly what you mean, and I've got just the place. And it was this. So I don't know, for everyone who's listening, if you think about Sydney, you think about the beaches and maybe the Harbour Bridge and the Opera House. You might have heard of Bondi Beach, which is the really famous, big, beautiful, beautiful white sand. It is an amazing beach, but a lot of people who are there are tourists or backpackers. And so I was like, look, forget about Bondi. It's where the tourists go. What you got to do is you got to go to Manly Beach, which maybe you've heard of. If you've been to Sydney, Manly Beach is sort of up on the northern side of the harbour. You have to catch a ferry to get there, and it's also pretty touristy. And so I said, you know what, go to Manly, and instead of going to Manly Beach, go to this like little hidden sort of alcove, sort of little inlet on the harbour side of the headland there. So you're not facing the ocean, you're facing back over the city, and go there in the evening when the sun's setting, and you can see the sun setting over the city, and it's beautiful. And I understand you went there and it was just sort of like not as advertised by me.
There were maybe 3 or 4 other people there, a lot of birds just hanging out on the shoreline. And we got there just in time. We really had to hustle because it was a bit of a walk after we got off the ferry. And probably just the ferry. Then we hustled over there, got there, the sun was setting. And then as the sun set, I realized, I bet he was here at a different time of the year when the sunset was actually good. Because it was not spectacular anyway. But, we tried.
And I mean, I suppose that's the risk, because from my perspective, if I had done that and I'd gone and it was a little bit nice but not that great, then go home, wouldn't really think about it, come back another time and it'd be spectacular. But for you, because you're only here, once sort of maybe a couple of times in your life, then maybe it sort of made me think maybe it would be better to spend a bit of time seeing Bondi or seeing Manly, seeing some of the places that are more sort of reliably spectacular. I don't know. So you take a risk. Sometimes it doesn't work out.
Yeah, it was an adventure. We still use it as an opportunity to take the ferry across because I think we had to land near Manly Beach, maybe not the same stop. You would know more than me, and I don't know if that's even relevant right now. We never did see Manly, but we did see Bondi the day before, 2 days before that. So we got a sense of the beaches there, and we just, I suppose we missed out on the sunset, the perfect sunset that might have been attainable somewhere else in the city.
Yeah, well.
No worries.
You do what you can.
No worries, mate.
Yeah, no worries, mate. That's right. That's the way to take it.
Spending time with you and a few others that live there, for a while I picked up on the accent and a few of the phrases that I liked. As the years have passed now, a couple of years, I don't use them anymore. I wish I would, because I think I was talking with someone from the UK recently, and for some reason, when I heard him speak, I thought he had an Australian accent. But then as I heard him talk more, I'm like, no, he doesn't, because the phrasing that you use in Australia and different parts of Australia, it seems to be much different, much thicker, probably the same as going like to the deep south here or whatever extreme parts of the country here. You get different lingo and a different accent. I really love the phrases that many of you seem to use in Australia, and I miss being around that.
It's interesting. I found traveling in North America, I needed to be careful about what I said, because, if you're in Australia, you anticipate people speaking with sort of these strange kind of aphorisms and, how you going, mate, all that sort of thing. But in North America, if you just pull something like that out, people are just going to look at you like you're speaking a completely foreign language. So I needed to be, it sort of made me more aware of how Australian I am when I was traveling, because I think I just thought that, it's just the air we breathe over here, really.
That's one of the notes I had for this conversation, the similarities and differences between the United States and Australia. So let's take turns here and just try to point out some things that, in addition to what you've stated already, that you really think stands out as different. I'll go first with this one. And this, I love how you do it in Australia, is the way the menus at the restaurants priced in a way like it's expensive, it seems, and the dollar exchange rate isn't quite the same. So it's maybe not as expensive as the number listed shows. But tell me if I'm wrong, it's the price of what you're ordering plus the tax plus tip included. It's all you know it precisely what you're paying for when you order. And it's brilliant. It's beautiful. And here it's kind of amazing. A guessing game. The price keeps escalating once you get the bill.
Oh yeah, I know. When I first went to North America, I was like, "Oh, this is quite cheap." And then you turn up and you have to pay, and you think, "Oh, there's a state tax, and then there's another state, and then there's a local some other charge, and then on top of that, you need to tip your waiters and waitresses, obviously, but that took a little bit of adjustment. I think so. They changed the law across the country about 20 years ago. They brought in we call it a GST, which is like a value added tax, or it stands for goods and services tax. And part of the law was that the GST needed to be included in any description of the price. So you can't say, this is sort of $18 and then you get to the checkout and it turns out it's $20 or something like that. It needs to advertise the price at, when you're looking at the menu or when you're looking at the product or whatever. And I think the reason they did that was because they were concerned that it would be really unpopular, the idea of introducing a new tax. And so they wanted to kind of hide it. Which is, a bit nefarious and sort of manipulative. But the upshot of that is that, it means that you just know what the price is when you're paying for it, and there's no confusion. Which I think an Australian innovation which could do with a bit of exporting, I think.
And people still tip there, but you don't have to. I remember talking to you. You made it the indication that it's not expected because everyone's paid a higher living wage You
Yeah.
tip, not expect it. So if you can explain to me how much someone that's working a service job, how much they're being paid, and how common is tipping?
How does that work? Yeah. So that was the other thing. When I went to North America, I was like struck by because tipping, I mean, in some ways it just changes the price, but it also changes something about the dynamic of how you kind of experience going out and being served. So in Australia, I mean, I tip maybe a couple of times a year, maybe when I go out. And often it's sort of, if you go out for a meal and it turns out to be, say for example, $96 and you're paying with cash, you just sort of give them the notes and say, don't worry about the change. It's not so much a gratuity on the top. Occasionally.
Would you say it's
What's
more
that?
convenience for you to just not deal with it and leave them a little bit?
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes you do. Sometimes if it's, you leave a little bit for the service staff occasionally, or if it's really good, or I don't know. I just tend not to. And the reason is because so there's a fairly high. I mean, it's getting a little bit worse, but there's a fairly high minimum wage of in Australian dollars. I think it's $20-something, which is equivalent to about $15 US. And that, so that's per hour. So that everyone's getting that. And if it's kind of like a high level restaurant, then maybe they'll be sort of not paying the minimum wage. They'll be paying kind of higher than that. So that's not great to live off, but it's kind of enough to get by. So sort of the assumption is that you don't need to pay the staff in order to have their, that's not their income. That's not their main income. The main income is from just their wage. And then if you do tip, then it's kind of on the top. The other thing is, maybe this is a separate point entirely, but one thing I've noticed is that, so, if you look at a Yelp review of a restaurant in the United States, there'll be three things. There'll be the food, there'll be the service, and then there'll be the kind of like atmosphere, decor, sort of, what's it like to experience that place. In Australia, the service is almost non-existent, as in in terms of a way that you would rate a restaurant, you basically wouldn't think about the service at all. And I don't know if that's a cultural thing or if it's to do with, because it's kind of front of mind if you're thinking about how have I been served by the waiters and the waitresses and stuff. You sort of immediately you have to think about how good the service is. But in Australia, it's just you don't really think about it, and then it changes a little bit. It changes the dynamic of how you experience. If you go to a cafe or a restaurant, sometimes they'll take you to a seat and they'll seat you, and then they'll come and get your order. And other times, it's not uncommon to have even fairly sort of upmarket places, especially upmarket sort of cafes, more kind of casual places. It's not unusual to have, a situation where you turn up, you find your own seat, you sit down, you look at the menu that's just on the table, you work out what you want, and then either someone will come out and get your order, or you just go up and order and pay at at the counter, and then they'll bring it out to you. And that's not, that would be unusual for a really upmarket restaurant, but for a cafe or whatever, that's pretty standard. And I understand that that's kind of completely sort of a different way of experiencing going out to eat compared to what it's like in North America, where there's a lot more emphasis on the service and on the kind of way that the place is inviting you in to serve you.
I've seen a bit more of that lately. I was at a Cuban restaurant in Minneapolis just a week or two ago, and that's what it was. I went to the counter and ordered. They brought the food out, but if I wanted water, I'd go get my own water from the cooler off to the side on the table, and there wasn't that much additional service, although I tipped him as I normally would. I didn't even think about it. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, and I wonder if partly that's because, I mean, the one of the strange things I found when in North America is sort of like if the tipping is part of the wage, then it's sort of like, you know, there's work to be done, and they need their income regardless of sort of what type of, you know, like if they try and make it more of a relaxed sort of atmosphere, and so there's less of a service culture, that, you know, the people who are there still need to be paid, and so you still need to tip, even if it's not necessarily like, you know, they're not doing the same sort of service that you would normally expect. So, and I remember thinking when I first went there as an adult in 2014 when we met, I remember thinking, this is so unfamiliar to me. I don't know which sorts of things you would tip at and which sorts of things you wouldn't tip at. Like, for example, you know, if you buy a takeaway coffee, do you tip? If you go to McDonald's, do you tip? If you take a taxi, do you tip? If you know, like, do you have to tip sort of after you check out of a hotel? You know, all of those things. Like,
the answer is becoming yes to more and more of those.
Sure, right. Which, yeah, it's an interesting sort of you know, you easily put your foot in your mouth when you're a foreigner in that situation, because, you know, I don't want to like sort of disrespect anyone, but I just, like, in Australia, the answer to all of those things would be pretty much no, unless you really wanted to. And generally, like at McDonald's or whatever, you wouldn't be able to tip. There's no way of, like, there's no process to do it. So
yeah, that's the one type of place. The fast service restaurants and maybe like the convenience stores, those types of things you don't. But and maybe people have been doing this for a long time, but at a hotel, I will leave at least a few dollars usually when I check out, because especially, and this is not, I don't know if it's even expected, but once I realize and really think about the people that clean my room, clean up after me, like that's a lot of work, and they're not getting paid.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, I'm tipping a bartender $1 for grabbing a beer in the cooler 2 inches behind them and turning around. But it's customary. That's what we do. But the person, the lady that might be from, say, Mexico or some Central American country originally, and that's the type of work that she can get, and she's cleaning my hotel room, well, I feel like she needs the money more and she's working harder, so I should really be tipping her. And it's really confusing. I just wish everyone
really
paid a living wage in correlation to how hard their job is, and we didn't have to think about that. So
I totally agree. Another Australian innovation. All right, so I've got another one that is related to this, but a little bit more subtle. I was speaking to a friend who, my friend works for Dolby, the sound engineering company, and they've got an office in San Francisco, and so he kind of, their head office is in San Francisco, so he goes over there sort of once a year, and a lot of his colleagues are American, and he has noticed that the word please has subtle but really significant differences in what it means, and I'd like to test this with you. Okay. So in Australia, pretty much you say please, like we tell our children, so, you know, when you're growing up, you say please all the time. You know, like if you ask for something, if you know, just the word please is the way that you make anything polite. So, you know, if you say are at a cafe, and they say, what would you like? And you say, can I have, you might say, can I have a coffee, please? Can I have would you give me a juice, please? And that's just, you wouldn't think about it. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily need to say it, but if you did say it, you would be part of the course. You wouldn't even think about it. And my friend was saying that he has discovered, or he's been told, that there's an implication in the US that when you use the word please, it means it's not just telling the person what you would like so that they can do their job. You know, like it's not just sort of part of ordering. It's actually, the implication is you're specifically asking them to do that thing for you and to sort of do it straight away. And so it's actually a bit more rude to say please than to not say please, because if you say ordering a juice from a cafe, then if you say, can I have a juice? Then that just means that they know what you want and they can go and get it for you. Whereas if you say, can I have a juice, please? He was saying, that implies that you would like them to go and go and make a juice for you, sort of, and presumably make it right now. And
so it should supersede everything else that they're doing.
And it's a bit more demanding. That's right. And does that ring true for you?
I don't know if I can give you an answer right now, because I'll need to experience this again to see how I say that and if other people say it in that way.
Right. It's interesting because he was saying, I must have been, making this mistake all the time. Because it's sort of subtle, but it's, if it is what my friend was saying, then it's interesting, and sort of maybe I've been sort of putting people offside by accident all the time when I've been traveling.
Yeah, I don't know if I agree with that. And just running it through my mind. I think if I were to be in the state of mind where I wanted someone in whatever aspect of service industry to prioritize my needs, I would interject with an excuse me, or somehow knowing that they are dealing with something else, interject in a way and then ask for my need instead of waiting for them to finish. And then I'd probably say please as well, but it would be the excuse me, the butting into whatever else they're doing, knowing that this is what I want, and I don't want to sit with this thought longer than I have already. I want to get it out to the person that can help me, and I assume that my need is more important there than whatever else is happening.
Right. Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, that's encouraging, because it sounds like maybe I haven't been putting my foot in my mouth by accident while I've been traveling.
Well, it's possible. Very possible.
Yeah. In that case, I've got one more, which is sort of a completely different, difference between the United States and Australia. So, thinking in terms of politics and governance and that sort of thing. In Australia, there's a couple of differences. Like, we have compulsory voting, which makes things interesting. We've got preferential voting. So you kind of, if your first preference doesn't is knocked out of the race during an election, then it goes down to your second preference, which means that it's much more, the kind of incentive is to be much more moderate than extreme. So that's kind of interesting. But the one I wanted to talk about was in Australia, we have 3 levels of government like you guys do. So we've got the federal Commonwealth government, which is sort of the government of Australia. You might have heard of Scott Morrison, who's our Prime Minister. He's the sort of the equivalent. It's a parliamentary system, but he's the kind of equivalent of the president, although it's a bit different how he gets elected. And then we have state governments, or some of them are territories, but they're sort of like the large regions. And then we have local governments that are just sort of the local councils. I understand that that's the same in North America, that you've got those sort of 3 levels. Maybe the local governments maybe are called city governments or county governments, or
both. It depends where you live, or in fact, I think they're like, if you live in a small town, say in my state in Minnesota, you'd be voting for the city's mayor, the city council, the school board, the county commissioners, as well as the state representatives, the governor, and then the United States representatives, the senators, the president. So there's probably more than 3, but it's local, state, and federal, I suppose, if you want to break it down that way. We do usually break it down that way.
Okay. So the thing that struck me as quite substantially different was that the responsibilities for most of the services in Australia sit at the state level. So I noticed you've got a map behind you that's got half of it scratched out for Australia. So the 3 states that you've been to, I think, are Queensland, which is the sort of top right northeast state, and then New South Wales, where I am, which is the sort of middle eastern state, and then the southeast is Victoria, where Melbourne is.
Tasmania.
Oh, and you've been to Tasmania as well. I couldn't see whether that was scratched out or not. That's the island that's at the bottom.
Yes.
So of those 4 states, of those 4 states, they make up huge land masses, and within there there's a series of local governments, but the responsibilities for the local governments versus the state governments. This is getting a bit wonkish, but bear with me. The state governments have responsibility for things like education, policing, sort of justice. So like, they run the prison system. What else? Agriculture, like emergency management, all of those sorts of things are run at the state level, not at the local level. So the difference is in North America, I think there's like, I don't know, something like 5,000, excuse me, there's like thousands of different police forces in, police organizations across the country. And, like North America has, Australia has a population of 25 million. So it's a smaller, in terms of population, much smaller than the United States. But for us, so I'm in Sydney right now. If I was to drive, 500 miles to the west of where I am, it would be the same police organization that was, running the policing in the town that I would get to 500 kilometers to the west, as 500 miles to the west, 800 kilometers, as it is right here. It would be, like obviously they would be divided up into regional kind of command structures and that sort of thing. But ultimately, they would all kind of be answerable to the same group at the top. And the same with education. If you are, like you go to send your kids to school down the road from where I am here in Sydney, it's the same organization, the New South Wales Education Department, that runs the schools that are like hundreds of kilometers away. And the upshot of all of this is not just sort of like esoteric kind of governance theory or anything like that. It means that the 2 things. It means, firstly, that if there is mismanagement or corruption, the way that gets managed is within the organization, because it's large enough that sort of mismanagement can be, so rather than just saying, well, that person's corrupt, so they're answerable to the people, you say that person, like if there's a school manager who's paying off their partner or something as part of, they're using their school funds to give them to some relatives or something like that, then that's corruption, and that'll be sort of like managed within the education system. So it sort of means there's a bit more, the institution, because they're bigger, it means that they're more sort of sturdy. Same with policing. Like if there's policing corruption, then, you don't have to necessarily be concerned that sort of within, like the city's police force, everyone knows everyone, and so it'll just be kind of hushed up. I mean, I think there might be a little bit of that sort of at a systemic level, but in order to hush it up, you need to hush it up kind of across sort of potentially like a huge organization that covers like hundreds of miles of, different communities, like millions of different people who sort of come under that. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is it means that when we elect people, we're electing the people who are kind of like in charge of the system, but then it's much more about sort of like changing. If you want to affect change, you can't just kind of come in and just sort of get rid of all of the people who are in charge, because the organizations are so large and complex if someone got elected, they'd be able to sort of fire the head of the department maybe, but they wouldn't necessarily be able to fire the people that are directly kind of managing, for example, individual schools or individual, police forces or individual hospitals or those sorts of things. And it means that, I don't know, because I was struck by, in North America, each city that we went to, each town that we went to would have its own police force. And so it sort of struck me that, like if there's, say, someone in that police force is corrupt, then, like to get rid of them, you need to sort of, you'd need to speak to their boss or the person, the elected representative who's in charge of the police force, for example. But they might be, they would personally know them. Whereas, because their organization's probably quite a bit smaller, if you have corruption in a police force of like 50 people, like they all know each other. So, much more difficult to root that out than in a much bigger organization where you can sort of, for corruption to exist, it would have to be systemic and like across whole groups. I don't know. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, or that's.
I don't really have a good understanding of how much corruption there is within law enforcement, for instance. What I can speak to is, like, my small town I grew up in used to have the police chief of Browerville, and maybe there's just one police officer for the entire city, and I don't know who he reported to exactly, or if he needed a backup, how that all worked. But at some point they got rid of that, and the county is in charge of that space now, and it's not very highly populated. So maybe there's the county sheriff and a handful of deputies. I don't know exactly, but there's also state patrol. So there are different organizations that are within the law enforcement that have like different jurisdictions, like the state highways and the interstate freeways are controlled by the Minnesota State Highway Patrol. Whereas even if that is in the county, and I don't know this precisely, perhaps the county deputy might be spending time patrolling that road as well occasionally. I'm sure they can travel there, but it is broken down into smaller chunks, as you say. So there needs to be communication between forces to get everyone to work together when they need to, or to hand it off to the other ones. And you see some of these police drama TV shows, some are based on true stories, some perhaps not, and maybe it's a dramatic thing on TV, but the different law enforcement agencies end up like trying to show their power over the other one and taking control of something where work together. But also I'd imagine there are some rivalries there, or there's some sense of who is more important or who should be doing certain work that they're not. I'm guessing if that's showing anything based on reality, the TV dramas of America, who knows, maybe it doesn't, that not everyone works together that well, and it can lead to some corruption in some ways. But I really don't know how corrupted we are in this country in that way, or in the political, whether it's Democrats, Republicans, federal, state levels. I don't know how corrupt we are compared to Australia or elsewhere. But there is some corruption of it.
And I'm sure it's probably the same everywhere. But it just sort of struck me when I realized that like you could have like a police force of sort of a handful of people. It sort of struck me like, you want to hope that those people are the right people. They're good guys, because otherwise, where do you go? What happens? I don't know. I don't know why my mind went to that sort of, because I'm sure there's other issues, but it just sort of struck me. I was like, oh wow, this is, I just had never thought about it like that, because where I grew up, there are no local police. There's only the state police. So anyway, one other thing.
Okay.
No, sorry, you go ahead.
Well, this is why I always find it so fascinating and important to travel, because if you live in your own little bubble, whatever part of the globe that you happen to be born on, and stay near there, the things that are normal around you, you just, I think, kind of assume are normal everywhere. You might know intellectually that they're not, but you don't have anything else to base it on. So you spend a handful of weeks of your life traveling through the United States, and these are the things that you think are just fascinating. Like, this is so odd. Why do they do it this way? Whether or not the system in Australia is necessarily better or worse, there's a
That's
huge
right.
difference. And for people that just think that their way is the normal way and the best way, which I think we get a lot of that in this country, maybe
Yeah.
because we're landlocked, or sorry, is it called landlocked? We're surrounded by all the oceans on the coast, and it's a big enough space, and you as well, that unless you really have an intention of traveling, it's not like Europe where you can get on a train and in a couple hours be in a different country. Here,
That's
unless
right.
you're growing up near a border in Canada or Mexico, you may never leave the country, and you may never leave your state very much. So you don't really know how things are done differently. And I'm led to believe things are done so much better. If you collectively took the things that are done the best, somehow you had, and they have these standings of rating to decide like who is the happiest, healthiest, who whatever. There's metrics used.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you were to use something like that and decide what the United States actually does the best, it's probably very few things. Whereas people that are from here and always spend their time here, I think, have a sense that we're just so great in all these ways, like "Make America Great Again," America
Yeah.
Still Great, or whatever the silly slogans are for President Trump. No, we're not that great. We're fine. We do a lot of things well, but there's places all over the world that are doing things much more exceptionally well, and we do not learn well from others that do things better.
I think, totally. I agree with you in principle about traveling. I think it's amazing. And like, I don't think Australia does things. I mean, I think there's some things that we do well that I'm, happy about and proud of. I think there's lots of things that we don't do very well. I mean, I think it's always a bit sort of chaotic, and there's a bit of a sort of, you can have the best of intentions, and then in putting it all together, it just sort of, things can fall apart. But I think in terms of what the United States does do well, I think there is a culture of working hard, which, like, part of it, I mean, what people say is that part of the thing about the difference between one of the differences between the culture of North America, the United States and Australia, is that you guys were founded by pilgrims, whereas we were founded by, at least in terms of like European settlement, we were founded by convicts. And so you guys have this sort of sense of like, deeply ingrained in your culture. There's a sense of like, if we just kind of work hard enough, we can kind of make like a utopia for ourselves. Mm-hmm. And whereas in Australia, there's a sense of, well, a lot of people who came here from England back, in the early colonial days, they were convicts, but they were convicts because of poverty. So like, people were stealing bread and that sort of thing, and they got shipped off to Australia. And like, that's my ancestors. That's how some of my ancestors ended up here. So there's a bit of a sense of like, the world's an unfair place, and like, unfair things can happen, and we sort of need to look out for each other. Whereas I think there's a bit of a sense in the United States of working hard is really important, and if we work hard, then we'll get there. Like, you'll get there if like, the thing that stops you is not working hard enough. And I think there's an element to which both of those things are right, and in different ways. So like, I think for example, I'm like inspired by like, you have put together like a podcast that you sort of like, you're building an audience, and you're sort of like working out what you can contribute to the world by by podcasting. And it's like very, in its own way, it's like entrepreneurial. You're sort of like setting out to make some effect change by this thing that you're doing. And it's like, no one's told you that this is the way to do it or anything like that. You've just sort of come up with this idea, and you've implemented it. My sense is that, like, people do that in Australia a little bit, but the idea of like a side hustle is not so much a thing in Australia as much as it is in America. And I think that's something that we can learn from the United States culture. The idea of like, well, if you've got an idea, then just see it through and do it. Like, get it done and see what happens. But then I suppose the other side is, like there is a, it can be good to, like, things fail in life for reasons that are sometimes they're to do with you, and sometimes they're absolutely not to do with you. They're just, the time and chance happen to us all, sort of thing. And I think, there's a bit more of a sense in Australia that we should kind of look after people who have been the victims of whatever it's, like, rather than sort of say it's your fault that whatever it is that's happened to you has happened. There's a sense that we should sort of, in principle, be looking out for people and looking after them. And yeah, I think that's a bit of a difference as well.
And I think that comes down to being the big difference between the two major political parties in this country. If you align with the Democratic Party, you're trying to look after other people's needs as much as or more than your own. And I think with the Republican Party, you're looking after yourself. Make sure you take care of yourself first and not concern yourself as much with others, knowing that if they took care of themselves, the thought is if they worked hard, if they did what they needed to do, they could make a life for themselves too. And as my life has gone on, I've shifted away from the Republican Party, which I grew up with, towards the Democratic Party. And I don't know if I even align with them specifically, but I'm much more on that side than I used to be, because I see people that just haven't been given a chance at life elsewhere in the world, especially, but even in this country. And I know some people don't work that hard, and working hard, as you stated, is so important in the United States. So people that look at that as being like one of the most important things that you can possibly have, you have to work hard, and they see people that aren't working hard, they don't tend to really care to help them as much. Like, okay, I'm working hard, you're not, tough luck, work harder.
Yeah.
And that maybe that doesn't happen elsewhere in the world so much. As a country, we've developed some amazing products and technology, maybe most of the best in the world, and I'm sure there's other great ones from elsewhere, but a lot of the real huge advancements do come from this country. But that's really a small subset of the people that are working hard. A lot of people are working hard in life, doing jobs that maybe bring them little to no joy and allow them very little free time or enjoyment of their life. And I see, when I was in Australia for 2 weeks, and I thought, oh, this is a long vacation for me, and people from Europe are there for 3 months, and you and your wife had used whatever part of 10 weeks to go after you finished your PhD program. And just the fact that people in other parts of the world take huge amounts of time to enjoy their life and to go places and do things, and not always work. 2 weeks of vacation a year, I think, is, some people have that and they're like, oh, that's not bad. No, that's awful. Why would you spend 50 weeks of your year working hard and 2 weeks doing something maybe that you might actually enjoy? I think there's something wrong with it. But then again, I'm from here, and I've seen other ways, so I'm probably missing something.
Well, especially, there was an idea in the 1930s that, like, by around this time, in economics, they talk about productivity increasing each year. So, like, if you've got a guy with a shovel, you upgrade that to a guy with a, excavator, then, like, you've increased the technology that they're using, and they can, suddenly they can produce more, or they can, like, build better houses or whatever so their productivity has increased by, technology advancing. So there was this idea that in the 1930s, that as technology advances and as productivity increases, we're going to get to the point where we're not going to have enough work to do. We're going to have to deal with, as a culture, this problem of leisure. Like, that there's going to be too much leisure time, not enough work to go around, and so we'll have to work out how to. I think these days people are talking about it in terms of a problem of automation, that, like, people's jobs are being automated away. I think it's the same question that people have been grappling with for, the better part of a century. And yet somehow or other, like, on average, we're still working, like, quite long hours. We're not working as long as people were in the 19th century. But on average, we're working, pretty much as long as we were, 50 years ago. And, there's a question there because, like people lived fairly satisfied lives 50 years ago, and they were, at least in an economic sense, much less productive than they are now because of the technological improvements that's happened. So where's that? Like we're richer than we used to be, but are we kind of in a really kind of profound, sort of well-rounded sense, more wealthy? Do we have more well-being than we used to? I don't know. I don't think so. I think maybe we're kind of roughly the same. And it seems to me that maybe that's to do with the way that we organize things or the way that we value things, that, like, even though we're more wealthy, rather than using that wealth to, for example, take more time off, go, see more of the world, like spend more time with friends and family, spend more time sort of doing creative projects or whatever. Instead of that, we're increasing the sorts of things that we want. So rather than, like being satisfied with sort of, like 50 years ago, people would have been satisfied with a black and white TV and, thought that was amazing. And, it's not that TV's changed, it's that the options have changed. That now you need like the latest smartphone and the latest sort of whatever to keep going and to kind of stay up to date. And I don't know, it sort of seems to me that there is another way of going that, is a little bit more satisfied with having things that are not up to date, and then that uses the resources that previously would have been used to get the kind of latest thing, and uses that on maybe spending a bit more time off during the year, or maybe working a shorter working week or shorter hours, or I don't know. I mean, it's not everyone has the opportunity to do that, but I don't know. I wonder if that's a way that we could be more satisfied and more like happy with life.
I think we could be more satisfied. And looking at my own life, I have side hustles. Like this in particular isn't a hustle at this point because it's not generating any income, but I do my side job, my Uber and Lyft driving. And that I've been doing the last few weeks, a lot less of it. But over the last few years, a lot of my free time, 20, 25 hours in a week might go to that so I can make more money, so I can travel more and do all these things, because either I feel I have to, or somehow I don't want to go backwards in income, and I want to keep on getting more and more and more. And that's a part of the American culture, I think, that has been ingrained in me to want more. Like I could live perfectly fine with what I have and not needing to go, not spending much. But now that I've gone, I feel like I need to keep earning.
Keep it up. So yeah, what is that? Is it a question of contentment, or is it a question of like now that you've had a taste, you realize how much is out there that you could experience? Or because I think there's two sides of it. Some of it's good, like it's really good to want to experience more of the world, but then like we're limited creatures. We can't experience everything. So maybe there is something good about being content with like or learning to be bored, maybe, or to be I don't know if that's a good thing.
The thing to think about might come down to competition, both in competition with the other and competition with ourselves. And I am constantly, it feels like, competing with the past version of myself to either have more money and then do more with my money, but also learn more. Like I don't want to go backwards in any given year. So eventually that kind of burns me out, I suppose. And maybe based on how you described Australia, people are maybe not as focused on doing more, having more. So there's more relaxation time. And there's certainly like villages in this world where people have a very relaxed life. They don't have much of anything, but they have enough, and their life is oftentimes stress-free, and they just kind of relax and enjoy their being and in their own little paradise?
I mean, it's that maybe it's hard to say, like, because how would you compare them? How would you know which one's the better way of being?
You can't. That's the problem.
You can't. Yeah, exactly. And yeah, because you could try and experience it, but then almost in thinking about that as an experience, like, you know, the experience of like living a relaxed life where you're, you know, like where you're sort of bored sometimes. If you think about that as a thing to sample, then almost you've kind of missed the point of it, because that, like, once that becomes a sort of commodity that you can like aim to get for yourself, then it's sort of like lost like a core element of what it actually is to live like that. Yeah, and then you can't really experience it.
If you're going on a 1-week cruise or a 2-week vacation where you're going to experience this, it is that in and of itself. It's this experience that you get to enjoy, knowing you're going to have it for 2 weeks, but it's the people that are living it for their entire existence. And I do know that there are select few people that end up leaving the life of the hustle and the bustle, as we call it here, and go to some quaint village or lakeshore, oceanfront, somewhere where you can live cheaply and do it. Like, that happens, and I suppose I could try that, but I mean, yeah, I probably should, but trying it isn't living it. And it's
that's right. Yeah, exactly. Sampling it, it's not, it's different. It's like qualitatively different to what it would be like to have that as your whole life. I don't know. And would that necessarily be better? I don't.
Maybe not. I enjoy a lot of the things here that I'd have to give up. Maybe I don't actually enjoy them that much. Maybe the stress I cause myself when my football team loses in the postseason isn't worth it. And if I just forgot they existed somehow, or never concerned myself with them, with the Minnesota Vikings again, for instance, maybe I'd be better off. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, how, and also once you've tasted, because I think that's the thing that you know, they say all around the world, once people taste the possibility of living life that's kind of a bit more of a kind of Western style, then it sort of takes hold within the, you know, like, and people, you know, so like you go traveling in Nepal or whatever, there's bits of it that are quite Western, or India, or, you know, like you know, a lot of Asian countries. There's bits of it that sort of like have like they, you know, they're the kind of idea of consumerism and the idea of you know, the relationship with work versus your relationship with family. It's sort of becoming more and more Western. So it sort of makes me think, once people get a taste of it, they don't really want to go back. But is it necessarily better? It's really hard to say. And maybe the other side of it is that there's good ways and bad ways of living life the way that we live life. That, you know, maybe a good part of it is being able to see the world, and, you know, like being able to challenge yourself with different sort of experiences of the world that's sort of like substantially different to your own and to what you've grown up with. But maybe the cost of it is that, you know, you end up with the stress and the being time poor, and maybe being kind of dislocated a little bit from your community. Yeah, and so
there might not be a right answer, but I do enjoy just the conversation, having these thoughts and throwing them around, because at least here, when we're in our daily grind, in a routine, these are things I might not think about that often. But knowing that you're on the other side of the world, having some of these same thoughts, capable of having these same thoughts, knowing that our lives are somewhat comparable, but they're also quite different.
Yeah.
I enjoy just kind of throwing it out there and seeing where it leads for us, and then anyone taking it in, and hopefully it adds value to someone who hadn't thought about this in the same way before.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's one of the things that I really appreciated about just the idea of this podcast, that there's a kind of earnest seeking for, maybe earnest the wrong word, a humble kind of seeking for a different way of life, with the assumption that, you know, maybe I'm doing some things right, but maybe I'm doing some things wrong, or maybe right and wrong's the wrong word. Maybe I'm doing some things well and some things poorly, and, you know, I could learn. And there's a humility that's sort of central to that question, which seems to be the kind of core question that this podcast is answering. Which I really respect that. I think it's a fantastic premise to have for, you know, what you want to explore. Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Make sure you tell everybody in Sydney.
I will. I have been.
Oh, really? Let's make a hard transition here. The main reason I thought to talk with you recently was the fires, and I think we've had some good news lately, but I don't really get a grasp of it. And I'm going to give my best explanation of Australia, and then you correct me in all the ways that I'm wrong. Australia is maybe a fifth smaller in land mass than the United States mainland. And I'd find that although it is comparable in the way that the coastal cities often are most populous in the United States as well, there are very few, if any, populated cities of any kind in the middle greater part of Australia. It gets very hot. There's not a lot of reasons for most people to live in the middle of Australia. There's some somewhat populated towns, but for the most part, if you're living in Australia, you are fairly near the coast. So there's been these massive fires, and I don't really know of how much of the country has experienced the fires, and you'll be able to elaborate on that. But for the most part, most individuals, I don't think were in direct harm of like being engulfed in flames, but much of the wildlife was.
Yeah, so that's right. Australia is extremely big. Like you say, about 4/5 of the land mass. But like I said before, 25 million people, so much, in terms of population, much smaller than the United States. And 90% or 85% or something live within 50 kilometers of the coast. So what's that, 30 miles? So people live in cities mostly, but also towns around the edges of Australia. And there are people that live in the middle, but you know, it's sort of 10 to 15% of the population. So the bushfires, the other thing is that the middle is really dry. And especially, you know, like, so like the climate has been changing. You know, you can sort of see graphs of rainfall patterns and heat patterns, and it's just getting hotter. And as it's getting hotter, the northern bit of Australia, which is sort of in the tropics, because we're in the southern hemisphere, the northern bit is getting wetter, and the southern bit is getting drier. So this last year was the hottest that it's ever been on record, and also the driest that it's ever been on record. So, you know, the record's going back sort of 100 plus years. So very hot and very dry, and that's coming off the back of like a drought that's been going on for a couple of years now. And so in that context, the vegetation has been, so the kind of, Australia has a lot of desert in the outback that we call it, and also, you know, just like sort of long stretches of farmland, sort of going out sort of hundreds of kilometers away from the coast, and then sort of further into the center of the continent, there's quite a lot of desert and just really arid, dry landscape where there's not very many. You know, you can drive for an hour and see one other person sort of thing. So it's quite remote the further out you get. But the sections near the coast where the population is much more heavily, there's much heavier vegetation. So there's a mountain range that goes from the sort of northeast part of Australia right the way down towards the southeast part. So sort of, you know, from near Brisbane, right the way past Sydney, and then down towards Melbourne. And on the eastern side of that is, you know, it's quite lush vegetation. There's normally a lot of rainfall. And that area has just been extremely dry And so, we had bushfires starting in Queensland. Queensland's normally understood as like quite a tropical area, and so you don't normally have bushfires or wildfires in the tropics. And there were bushfires in Queensland, and they sort of started the first week of spring. So normally the bushfire season is kind of this middle of summer. So we're kind of where we are right now, which is like summer for us is December to February. So December, January really is our bushfire season, and then it goes a bit further south in January, February. But in the first week of spring, so the first week of September, we had some bushfires in Queensland. So that's unusual because it's like 1 week out from winter, and also that it's in an area that really very rarely burns. And then, so that was a bit alarming. And then it's just sort of grown since then, because there just hasn't been really any substantial rainfall until the last week for months, for 3 or 4 months. So the bushfires sort of started in the northern part of the state of New South Wales and up in Queensland, and then as the months progressed, they kind of gradually moved further and further south. And yes, you're right to say that the kind of areas that have burned have been kind of forested areas. So they've been quite good at evacuating people from those areas. Like a lot of the areas that have burned have been national parks. So people, they'll just close the national park and put out alerts saying, do not enter the national park. And, like if there are cars there, they'll do kind of, like they'll search for people and they'll evacuate them from the area. And then, so because they roughly know where the greatest risk of fire is, and they're pretty sort of risk averse. So, for example, my wife and I were camping in a national park in November, which is before the beginning of summer. So it shouldn't really have been in the fire, high risk fire time. But it just happened that they've got these algorithms that work out the heat and the projected dryness and the wind and everything. And they worked out that it was just going to be a catastrophic risk of fire. And so we were evacuated from the national park we were camping in, and we ended up, driving all the way down to Victoria to camp in the national park down there. But so the national parks all around Sydney really have burnt progressively. And it's not only national parks, it's also some areas near there, but most of the areas that have burnt have been sort of in or near national parks. So I think there's been maybe 25 or 30 people who have died. Quite a few of those people have been firefighters, and some of the stories about people who have died have been horrific. So the fire, the engines that the vehicles that they drive in are fireproof. So I don't know, there was a video that was doing the rounds maybe a month ago, where this group of people were just driving through a firestorm, like they were in the path of a fire, and they just were they had to put up this shielding on the windows, and the fire just swept across the path of where their vehicle was, and they were okay. So the vehicles themselves are designed to withstand the heat of the fire. But there's been some just extraordinary, like really unusual, specific local weather events, like fire tornadoes, and where there's like a vortex of wind that's connected to a fire, and so because of the heat and the weather and the dryness, it sort of creates its own localized sort of weather pattern where so a couple of people died because they were in a vehicle that was safe, safe from the heat, and you can imagine this is one of those heavy water tankers. But the heat was so intense that it created a localized sort of weather system that actually blew over the tanker, and they died sort of in a kind of like a car crash because their tanker just blew over.
So it withstood the heat, but it broke apart or something cracked.
Because of the wind. The wind knocked the tanker over, which just is sort of an extraordinary, the amount of heat that would have needed to be there to create a weather system like that could knock over a fire engine is just sort of astounding to think of. And then so the other side of it is the amount of vegetation that has burned has been just like millions of hectares have been burned. Some of the fires are just like hundreds of thousands of like just miles and miles and miles and it's all burned. And what that has done is it's created a huge blanket of smoke that has kind of settled over, for the course of months over the really heavily populated area. So there's been, I think, a handful of fires within the bounds of the city of Sydney, for example, but not very many, and they've been fairly quickly put out. But there have been some bushfires that are sort of, maybe 50 miles, 100 miles away, that have created, like up in the mountains, that have created a thick blanket of smoke that's kind of then come down and just sort of settled on the city of Sydney and has just really stayed there for sometimes days at a time. And what that's done is, so basically we don't really know what the implication of that is. We know that it can upset people who have asthma, and there have been a couple of reported cases of people who have died, because of asthma attacks. And apart from that, we know that, there's issues like, there's good evidence that like particulate matter that's in smoke can exacerbate heart conditions and, lead to premature births and all things like that. But we don't really know, like, because it's kind of, a unique event. I was looking at, I was trying to find out. So my wife is pregnant at the moment, and like how concerned should we be? I don't know. The advice that's coming out seems to be that pregnant women are one of the most sort of vulnerable populations, and there's some evidence that maybe it can cause low birth weight babies or to be born, or premature babies to be born. But how much of a risk is it? And yeah, I don't know. Because it's sort of like something that really hasn't happened really at this level of fire and for this prolonged period. So, to have smoke events happening from really sort of October all the way through to January to, so there's a air quality monitoring website that says if the air quality index is above 200, then that's hazardous. So it's like safe if it's under 30 sort of, or 50 or something like that. And there have been days when it's been, in Sydney, it got up to, I think, 2,800. So that's like 14 times above the hazardous level. Wow. Yeah, it's just extraordinary. And then in Canberra the other day, it got up to 5,000 something. So, just sort of like way off the scales. And we don't know, like, is that, what is that the equivalent of in terms of like as a health issue? It's likely, like this is a bit of a morbid thing to say, but it's likely that that's going to kill many more people than who were actually killed by the flames of the, like being burned, or killed directly from the bushfires. But we won't really know that until, how would you be able to tell, like, if someone has a heart attack, how can you tell whether that's, because they used to smoke 20 years ago or because of the air quality?
Like you
It's
can.
really hard to say. You can't, yeah. And it's the same, in terms of, so we've like been trying to make sure that our house is shut up as much as possible, when it's sort of a smoky day, but to what extent does that sort of protect you from the smoke, and to what extent is that just like a placebo? Like, is it just sort of making us feel okay? It's really, we can't say. So it's been psychologically very difficult to I think so. For example, I mentioned when we first met, we went to North America to. I was going to North America to a wedding in Montreal. On New Year's Eve, I got a Happy New Year message from my friend who was married. He lives in Chicago now, when he sent that message, I just sort of thought, oh, look, the whole attitude of everyone in Australia was sort of like, oh, this isn't a time to celebrate. This is a time to, I don't know, like it's like the whole country is sort of in a state of mourning, sort of thing, because of the the bushfires, but also just the, everyone just has to spend most of their time indoors because the air quality is so terrible. And and then in terms of, you were saying like not that many people are affected directly from the bushfires. It has actually been, it's been really interesting, because so Australians mostly, most offices and businesses shut down sort of between Christmas and New Year's. So that week, between like at the end of December and to the beginning of January, most businesses were closed, and so a lot of people were taking holidays, and a lot of people went down to take their holidays down on the south coast, south of Sydney. So that's people from Canberra, which is the capital of Australia. They would come down to the coast often, and people from Sydney often they'll go down and spend time with their families down on the south coast. I did that for 10 years, so I know a lot of these areas that have been completely sort of wiped off the map, sort of thing. It's been interesting because if the fires happened maybe a month beforehand or a month afterwards, it would have been less. It would have had less of an impact on the people who live in cities, in like the big cities. It would have been devastating for the people who were there. But because it happened right over that period around kind of Christmas, New Year's, a lot of people were kind of either evacuated or they were directly affected by, they were, so like, for example, one of my colleagues, she spent her break down on the south coast in a town called Bateman's Bay, which is one of the towns that was affected. And just for 4 days, she didn't have power, didn't have internet, didn't have telephone. Like, no, there wasn't any cell coverage because the fires had affected the cell towers. All they had was a radio that they could listen to see when they could, because all the roads were closed, so they couldn't evacuate. All they had to do was basically, be careful, keep monitoring the radio, and if the fire was going to come into the town, they needed to get out, like into the water, sort of thing. And that's just, like my colleague. I imagine probably most people would have stories. If they didn't experience the fires directly, they would have had, known the places, or they would have known people who were maybe evacuated or who had, experiences like that. Most people sort of in this area in Sydney and down in Melbourne and Canberra would have had, either direct experiences like that, or would have had sort of friends who had that experience. And it's just really affected the mood maybe, or the kind of psyche of the whole country, because people, there's a sense that this is extraordinary. It's never happened before. And, like, we've got to change things. If this can't be the new sort of normal way that things are. I don't know. So that's been my experience of the bushfires. I don't know if that's sort of resonates with what you've heard on the news. I suppose the other side of it is you might have heard about the koalas and that sort of thing. And yeah, it's just been devastating to hear about the habitat loss and the direct, like you see pictures of farmland where there's just mobs of dead sheep or
they come up with these numbers of how many animals have died, and who knows how accurate they are, but I'm sure they're reasonably accurate.
Within the ballpark, yeah.
It's kind of it's a number that you can't even comprehend.
That's right.
But then again, I don't know what's the total wildlife population, like how close to extinction will this set some of these species, or will they be able to recover if this happens every year or every few years? This obviously, that would be horrific. I guess I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think no one knows at this point. I think this is the thing, because it's a unique event. It's never happened before, and we think that there's been whatever it is, 500 million animals or something. Maybe that's right. I mean, that's an estimate based on the kind of like the density of the animals within sort of national park areas, and then they said they've kind of extrapolated that out based on how much area has been burnt. Who knows? Maybe there's some resilience there. Maybe it's going to be more effective. It's really hard to say. And the other thing is that there's some areas that have burned that have never burnt before. The thing is, with the Australian bush, because we've got a lot of eucalyptus trees, they have fire is part of their life cycle. So they need a bit of fire to germinate their seeds, and some of their seeds don't. Some species, their seeds open when they experience smoke, and so they need to have like some fire around every sort of couple of years in order to propagate the species. And the other thing is that they're very rich in sort of eucalyptus oil, so they burn very kind of easily. And they're also like resilient, so you can have a tree that burns and then sort of it looks like it's dead, but then 6 months later you'll see sort of fresh green shoots coming out of it. So fire is kind of a normal part of the life cycle and the ecosystem in this part of the world. But this level of fire, like where it's just completely wiped it out, and there's this level of heat and this level of dryness. At my parents' house, they haven't experienced the bushfire directly, but it's been so dry that a lot of trees have just died. So that they've dropped all of their leaves, and that the trees just sort of dried up, and now they're dead. Which it's sort of, this sort of thing has really never happened before. So it's hard to say at this point how resilient, to what extent will the bush be able to cope with this kind of event, and will it be able to bounce back in the way that it normally does, and also because there's been some areas that are actually like the kind of rainforesty sort of areas that normally don't have fire as part of their natural ecosystem. So will they be able to bounce back? At this point, we just don't know.
And is the worst of it over for this summer, would you say, with the recent rains? Or can you not even say that?
Well, so we're about halfway through summer now. So possibly if it dries out again, there might be a bit of a risk. The other thing is it tends to go north to south. So it started up in Queensland, and it's covered New South Wales, and now we're past the main fire season for sort of this area where Sydney is, but the other main city in Australia, Melbourne, they're just kind of getting to their main fire season. So there's been recent rains. Is that going to be enough to protect them? Has that been in the right areas? I'm not really sure whether. So I mean, February really is their kind of month that they're really concerned about fire danger down there. So it's possible that it's just going to continue, and instead of seeing pictures of smoke covering Sydney, you'll see pictures of smoke covering Melbourne. That's, you know, I hope not, but yeah, it's possible.
This clearly, I would imagine, is the continued major news story in Australia. What else makes big news in Australia when you're having these worst fires of a lifetime?
Yeah, well, so I mean, the interesting thing is Australians tend to like, I'm into I follow the news and that sort of thing, but most Australians are kind of pretty content to, especially this time of year, not follow it at all. The things we follow are the cricket, which is like, I don't know if you're familiar with cricket. It's kind of like baseball. Except
I went to a cricket match in Melbourne.
Yes, good. Okay, great. And the Australian Open, which is on the tennis. There's a yacht race, which people don't really follow. You know, that sort of thing. People read books, you know, like play board games. People aren't really that interested in the news at this time of year. But this fire event, it's just been it's really cut through. The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, our leader, he went on holidays to Hawaii because, he had some scheduled time off, which is sort of fine, like on one level, but also the pictures. So some people who were also in Hawaii took pictures of him sort of sitting on a beach, I don't know, like drinking a cocktail or something, while at the same time that there were like bushfires burning and firefighters being killed and that sort of thing. And that sort of image of him on the beach, like enjoying a, you know, tropical sort of Pacific island, and on the other hand, like koalas being burnt to death and you know, like firefighters, you know, being killed and just, you know, millions of hectares of bushfire being burnt through. That really kind of galvanized people and in a way that, you know, so people are a bit more kind of outraged by that than people normally would be in this time of year. The other thing is that it's kind of affected. So I don't know if you follow the tennis, but so the Australian Open is just starting now, and Melbourne had hazardous air quality the other day, and there was a kind of there was a qualifying match, and some of the athletes had like broke out in asthma because, well, you know, fair enough, they're sort of like at sort of operating at peak level, and they're in hazardous air quality, where, you know, you can smell it as soon as you step outside. You're sort of breathing it in, and so I don't know what they're going to do. If this set of rain that's just started in the last day or two, if that doesn't put out the bushfires near Melbourne, if they continue in the next couple of days, then it's not unlikely that Melbourne's just going to be covered for days in sort of thick smog. And I don't know, like, are they going to cancel the Australian Open, or are they going to try and move it at the last minute to another city? Or so it's in some ways it's the news, even though like normally Australians don't care about the news, especially in January, but it's really cut through like as a major event, just because it's just so different to what it normally is like. It's just in a way that, yeah, it's cut through in a way that just we haven't seen before. Yeah.
I feel like there's so many things I could talk with you about, but we've already gone kind of long compared to what I normally do. So I'll go to my final segments.
Yeah.
And let's get into my personal growth segment. You've alluded to it earlier in this conversation that is what this podcast is about. Ways I've changed my mind, been wrong, ways I'm trying to grow, and then trying to grab that from other people that I've known and met to see what they've done as a way of putting that back out to the world and maybe helping whoever it might land on. So when you hear about personal growth and a story that you've considered from your life of how you've grown and changed in a positive way, what do you want to share with me?
Okay, so I feel like, I just, like I was saying before, I just feel like this is an excellent question to ask myself, and I really appreciated that you asked that. And I think it's just there's a humility and an earnestness in asking those questions about what, personal growth. That just resonates with me, and I think it's fantastic. So the thing that struck me in terms of personal growth, I think what's been really significant in my life, probably one of the most significant things in my life, is I started volunteering at a community center when I was like 10, 12 years ago, maybe. I started volunteering at a community center that's at a church, just sort of in Sydney. And yeah, it's sort of, there's a meal that's served, and then there's some other support services like some legal aid and some, some sort of referrals to housing support and that sort of thing. So a lot of people, some people who come in are like homeless on the street sort of thing. A lot of people are in, temporary accommodation. A lot of people are pretty marginalized, like pretty, the thing that attracts them is that it's like a good free meal sort of thing. And there's something about being part of that community that, I don't know, it's really changed my life, because, and I put it down to being in a community that is filled with people who are really substantially different to me. Because it's sort of like what you were alluding to before when you were talking about traveling, sort of challenging your assumptions about what's normal and what's kind of the way that life is. I think that you don't necessarily need to travel to get that, because I think there's like, the way the world works is that there's like lots of different worlds kind of superimposed on top of one another, where, like if you're in one kind of social context, you'll experience the same place in a substantially different way to other people. So like, for example, there's the main street that this church is on, is called King Street. And, I've walked down King Street with, I've walked down King Street all the time, like, every kind of couple of days, because it's kind of near our house. I have never been offered drugs walking down King Street. However, when, like a couple of times, I've walked down King Street with, I've just bumped into people that I know from the community center, and we've sort of just, wandered down and had a coffee together or whatever, or just, had a chat. And it's not uncommon that people from the community center who are sort of in that like marginalized sort of, life experience, they'll often be like, it's really quite common that they'll be offered drugs and walking down the same stretch, which means that like, as I'm walking down King Street myself, I'm like walking past all of these people who are kind of happy to like potentially sell drugs to me, but for whatever reason, they look at me and they think this guy is not interested. Whereas they look at my friends that I've met through the community center, and they say, this is a person who maybe would say yes. And so, yeah, it's been eye-opening to walk down that same stretch of street with another person and see how like substantially different their experience of that, like, just that physical geography has been compared to mine. I think, because it means that you can't be confident that your experience of a place is necessarily the experience of a place. Because anyone else, like, what it says to me is that anyone else might go through the same, be in the same place and have really a substantially different experience. And yeah, I don't know. I think it's yeah. Maybe I'll just leave it there. That's been one of my kind of key areas of personal growth, in the sense that I've become, I think, more humble about the way that I experience, or I reflect on my own experiences of the world, because I kind of have increasingly realized that other people's experiences of even things that I'm familiar with can be really substantially different from my own.
That's very enlightening. And also the fact that in that situation, there's a stereotype against you as being someone that's going to be less interested in this, or maybe they don't want to deal with you based on the way you look or you dress.
Yeah.
Maybe because you look or dress, my guess is, more well-to-do than the people you're walking with. I can't say for sure. I'm not there, but I think that's where you're going. So,
Yeah. I think it's something like that. I don't know. But plus, it's like embodied. Like it's, if you live a rough life, you end up having like a more sort of crinkled face, more, more wrinkles, more, I don't know. There's in the way that you carry yourself when you walk. I don't know. It's but it is eye-opening. It's yeah. People have different experiences.
and
I mean, it sounds obvious to say, but
let's assume I don't know your past drug use, if there's been any. Mine has been very minimal. And my hunch is yours is probably somewhere in that direction. But for someone
that's right.
that doesn't have a lot going on, where they're kind of in the same space, they don't have a lot of work, that when you get offered the opportunity to experience something, anything, maybe someone's opinion is it's best I don't do whatever that's being offered to me. But in that moment, there's not that much going on, perhaps. It's an experience. It's something you can do that might make you feel better for a moment. So I can see why people in certain communities get into situations where drugs are a very big part of their life and what they need and what they strive for. And in addition to the fact that most of these things are very addictive and hard to get away
That's
from,
right.
to get into it.
That's right.
So what we value, what we feel will be entertaining or worth our time or money, will change based on our economic status and how much free time we might have, all these things. And you're experiencing that in a way where you're being treated differently in the same space. Whereas I'd imagine at some point, and maybe I'm wrong with this, that if you were offered every day, whatever, for days and weeks and months, even with your current position, at some point you might soften on it and say, oh, what the heck, let's try it.
Yeah, that's right. It's because the question is, I think, what's normal? Like what's normal in my life? It's normal for me to sort of walk down the street and not be offered drugs. And it's normal for me to sort of not use drugs. Whereas for some people, it's normal for them to walk down the street and it's just like, there's a coffee shop over there, you can get a coffee and that guy's selling, crystal meth, or, that it's just normal. It's good part of the life. And, in the same way that, like, I didn't grow up drinking a lot of coffee. That's also another thing that's quite different between Australia and the United States. The coffee here is like, has an Italian and Greek influence. And I think personally, that's a definite improvement. But putting that to one side, like, I didn't grow up drinking coffee. But at some point, I don't know, when I started working and people in the office drank coffee, and, then I started drinking coffee, and then I sort of got used to it, and now I drink coffee every day. Whereas, for other people, that might be using, like any other drugs, like that, you sort of maybe think, oh, I don't really need that. And then someone offers it to you, your friends are using it, or it's somehow or other, it just becomes normal for you. And then, then it just sort of becomes part of your routine. And the difference is that for coffee, like, firstly, sort of in terms of its psychoactive properties, it doesn't really, like, it affects you a little bit, but it doesn't affect you hugely, especially if you sort of drink it in the morning and don't drink it in the evening. Really doesn't have that much of an impact on your life. But also, like, legally, you can get it easily. It's pretty cheap. there's not really any, like there's no regulation that does. It's definitely not going to kind of put you in on the offside with regard to like the, becoming a criminal.
Which meant,
whereas
even though you had no interest in it for a long time, you eventually just gave in and started doing it. But if there was a criminal element to it, you may have never picked up that habit either. It's possible. Maybe
it's possible. Yeah, that's right. But then it's also, I think the question is, I think it's about what's normal, because the other side of it, because there's a criminal element to using, say, in Australia, still marijuana, although I understand that's changing a bit in the United States, but definitely harder drugs. There's sort of a, if you're in a community where using those drugs is normal in the same way that using coffee is normal for me, then, suddenly what's normal for you is illegal, and maybe that changes the way that you relate to the law. Because I mean, I sort of just tend to think like you do what's like, you follow the law. That's it's pretty sort of straightforward. You don't really have to think about that very much. Whereas if the like drugs that I used that were freely available and normal in the kind of community of people that I lived in were illegal, then I'd have to think more carefully about that. And I mean, I think there's a lot to be said to making like following the law the easiest thing for everyone to do. And I think for a lot of people, it's not necessarily the easiest or most straightforward thing if you're in that sort of marginalized community.
And just to kind of call back what you talked about earlier, the fact that most or all of the early European individuals that ended up in Australia were people that might have committed a petty crime. You mentioned stealing bread, and that would get you, 7 years or 14 years? You'd be kicked off to
something like that, yeah.
For a very petty crime, it seems, at this time. So the way that someone looks at crime at a different point, time and place in history, and how serious they're taking that risk, or how important it is to take that risk, we all have a different value on that. And the way you were raised, perhaps the way that I was raised, very rarely do I put myself in some sort of legal jeopardy historically in my life, but someone else might have been raised in a way where that whatever you do to survive or get to the next day is what you do. And if that is breaking some law, so be it. Whereas
that's right.
I wasn't put in that situation where I felt like every day I needed to act in a way to keep my sanity, or myself free, or myself happy or fat or whatever.
Yeah.
It wasn't a daily concern, but I know for some people, every day, every hour, they've got to make these choices that I would certainly not make in the same way they do, but they're presented differently, and you experience that based on your story.
Yeah, exactly. And which means that what it means to follow the law for me is, even though in absolute terms, it's the same. It's the same law for me as it is for anyone else. But like following the logic of what you were just saying to its conclusion, what it means to follow the law for me is quite different to what it means to follow the law for someone who's in that situation where, they're sort of like the community that they're in places different emphasis on following the law. So I think we have a really black and white thinking about, like a way of thinking about the law that think some things are legal and some things are illegal. And I think that's true to an extent, but it's also unhelpful to another extent. And that, I think it's not necessarily to justify it in any way, and especially not things that where there's harm involved to other people. But it's to it's to kind of, for me, to recalibrate my understanding and my expectations with regard to and to be humble with regard to sort of the way that I think about other people and the reasons why other people might live their life the way that they do.
Yeah, to view someone else's choices based on the lens of our own life and why we do the things we do, and expect them to do the things that make choices in their own life based on what we do, it's really kind of silly. So it's easy to see the world, of course, through our own eyes, and it's harder to try to come up with the vision that someone else and the lifestyle someone else is living. But to keep that kind of in the front of the mind occasionally, to know that everyone's life is different and the choices they make, they have reasons for them, and it's everything they've done has led up to that choice being the choice they make in that moment. Of course, you and I might not make the same choice, but it doesn't mean we should degrade them based on the choice that they believe they are forced to make or decide to make at any one time.
That's right.
Let's now move to our final segment, the Being Wrong segment. It's about change, how you've changed your mind. Personal growth is about change, but this is more where you can look back and say, I was definitely wrong about something in the past based on the way I view this thing now or do this thing now.
Yeah. All right. Exercise. So when I was young, I was a bit of a chubby kid, but also I think part of that was like I just had this idea that like physical bodies are like kind of not what life is about. Like I think, have you ever met anyone who's a transhumanist?
I don't know if I'm familiar with that term. I think I've heard it, but I can't even place what it is.
Yeah, it's sort of this idea that, like through technology, we'll kind of expand, we'll go past like the limitations of our physical bodies or whatever.
Live forever or much, much, much longer?
Yeah, or like some of them are a little bit like that, but also sort of like, they're into sort of like, like just 3D, at one stage we'll get to being able to 3D print a new arm or whatever. So who needs to go to the gym because you just be able to get yourself a, like a buff new body or whatever by like, buying plans for it on the internet or whatever. I don't know. So, and then the kind of like extreme sort of end of that is about like, they talk about sort of, maybe in the future we'll be able to like download our consciousness into the computer or whatever. And I don't think I didn't have any of those ideas sort of in any sort of well-formed way. But on reflection, I think I sort of had that idea that, like life is not really about how you are physically in your body. And actually like physical bodies are kind of like silly or sort of like limited, and paying attention to that is kind of a bit like simplistic sort of thing. I think that's, and I was trying to think about this, like where did that come from? Because that definitely didn't come from my parents, or maybe it came a little bit from like, I don't know, reading science fiction books when I was a kid or something like that. But yeah, I just had this idea when I was a kid that it was like a bit sort of silly to be interested in like looking after my physical body. And as I've grown older, I just think that that's just really wrong on lots of different levels. It's wrong because like, well, like it's good to be healthy and it's good to be, fit and like I think it's satisfying to be able to, like do something that's rigorous, that's physically demanding, and be able to do that and sort of be okay with, like it's satisfying to like we were saying before, to say, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do a triathlon. I can't do it now. I've got a plan to train up, like I need to run however many kilometers this week. And then next week I need to run however many more, and need to swim however many kilometers this week. And next week swim X many more. And, to get to the end of like after 12 weeks and be able to do the sort of whatever it is, the triathlon or the the Sparta run or whatever, like that, I think that's a really satisfying thing to go through. But it's also like on a deeper level, I think I got it wrong about who we are as human beings. I thought that what it meant to be a human being was to be a mind, regardless of a body, not necessarily detached from a body, like in a kind of like, you know, science fiction-y sense or philosophical sense, but regardless of your body, what it means to be a human is to be a mind. And now I'm much more, I think what it means to be a human is to be like, yes, there's a sort of an intellectual and emotional and sort of spiritual and social kind of element that is a bit sort of set aside from the physical kind of embodied sort of experience of having a body. But all of that, all of that is informed by your physical body. Like it's informed by, like if being human is about your mind, then like it's significant that you can't think properly if you haven't slept well, or that you go into like a carb coma after you've eaten a huge bowl of pasta or something like that. So it's sort of like, who we are is like we are minds, but we're also embodied, and like those two things can't be separated. And so it means that sort of like it's just wrong to think that it's silly to or simple or facile to be focused on your like physical experience of the world. It's like it's a good thing to jump into physical stuff, like and to get stronger, to get fitter. It's like a satisfying thing, and it also is sort of something about, it's more what it looks like to be flourishing as a human being is to be healthy and to be kind of well and to be fit, as well as to be kind of like intellectually challenged and pushing yourself in terms of your own character and all of those sorts of things. So yeah, I think looking back, if there's one thing where I straightforwardly I can just say, yep, you got that wrong. It's about that. I think if I could speak to my like 13-year-old self, that's sort of what I'd say.
I don't think health was emphasized in my childhood in the way that I perhaps wish it was now. I was also a chubby kid, and even though I'm kind of a slender build guy as an adult, I still feel like a chubby kid based on what's been left behind over the years. And
yeah, that's true. It affects your kind of like the way that you think about yourself as well, which is, it's interesting because I sort of feel the same way. Like, I don't think I'm that fit now, but I'm much fitter than I was before. But I sort of maybe in some ways still think about myself as someone who like wasn't that fit or wasn't, but it's definitely a better experience of life to make yourself fitter. Yeah, and to be on the trajectory. I mean, one of the things I've learned about, because I started, working out at a gym sort of maybe 2 years ago, and something that I've learned over the last 2 years is that there's a thing in in strength training called progressive overload, which is the idea of like, you work out what you work out sort of, you identify what it is that you can lift at a certain, in a certain exercise for a certain number of repetitions or whatever, and you go lower than that. And so, you're not pushing yourself to the absolute extreme. So you go, maybe 70% of that or 80% or something. And you just make sure that each week you're adding a little bit of extra weight. And so you go to the gym and you're lifting, I don't know, sort of 20 kilos one week, and then the next week you make it 21 kilos or 22 kilos or something. And then over time, you find that you just kind of get substantially stronger, which is a really satisfying thing to, I mean, it's sort of sounds a bit obvious, but it's a really satisfying thing to sort of work out how to do in principle, and to experience just slowly and steadily kind of becoming more fit. You know, it's a satisfying thing to be able to do.
I really appreciate and have appreciated in the conversation your thoughtfulness and your introspectiveness. I feel like maybe that's probably why we connected the first time.
Yeah, I think it might have been.
I think we're similar in that way, where I enjoy hearing your thought processes as you go through them, and you're very aware to not leave much out, because you believe it all. It seems like you believe it all. It all ties together and all matters, and you're very self-aware of how these things have played into your life and the world around you. So I appreciate that. And I can only hope that the people that have hung in there with us, hung in there for a couple hours, that they must appreciate that as well, if that's what they've done. Because this is what I like. Just a long form conversation about whatever, but with you is things that I haven't really talked about with a lot of people, because you have this different perspective from a different part of the world. And I'd imagine, whether it's see you again someday or do this again in some way before too many months pass, that we'll be in touch in the future. So I thank you for.
I'd love that, Curt. I just think that's fantastic, and I appreciate what you're doing in this podcast. I think it's a good. I've said this before. I think it's great. Yeah, So I'll see you when I see you.
Thank you, Alec, and we will talk soon. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks.